The oil lamps had burned low by the time the doors were barred. I in the upper chamber of a modest stone house overlooking the harbor of Ephesus, Master Aurel stood in stillness while his 12 students sat in a tight semicircle around him. The city outside had not yet fallen asleep, but inside that room the air felt suspended, almost dense, as if something invisible pressed gently against the walls. They had just finished their evening meal. No one spoke. No teaching scroll lay open. No parable was offered. Instead, Aurel held 3 small branches in his hands. One was a slender stem of hyssor, its leaves thin and aromatic. The second was a young cutting of mountain cedar, its scent deep and resinous even without being crushed. The third was a pale, silver-green sprig known among desert mystics as white flame. He did not raise his voice when he began. These, he said softly, are not symbols. His eyes moved from face to face. Some of the students shifted uncomfortably. Others leaned forward. They are not poetry, he continued. They are frequencies. The youngest among them, a quiet man named Saren, felt something tighten in his chest before he understood why. It was not fear. It was recognition, a subtle warmth, like an ember long buried beneath ash. Aurel walked slowly to the center of the room and placed the 3 branches on the low wooden table. You have been taught to guard your thoughts, he said. But you were never taught what enters before a thought is born. The lamps flickered as if in response. There are currents in this world, Aurel went on, that do not belong to the true source. They move through the air like wind through reeds. You do not see them, yet you feel their touch. One of the older students, Malek, frowned. Spirits, he asked carefully. Aurel shook his head. Not spirits in the way the priests describe. They are administrators of a flawed design. They operate through vibration, not claws. Through suggestion, not force. He lifted the branch of hyssor. This plant interrupts the lowest current, he said. The one that enters the body as sudden fear without cause. The tightening at night. The surge of dread that arrives when silence deepens. Several men exchanged glances. They had known that feeling. Aurel placed the hyssor back on the table and picked up the cedar. This one straightens what has been bent. When confusion spreads like mist and you cannot remember what you were meant to do, that is not weakness. It is interference. Cedar clarifies. It holds alignment. Finally, he raised the white flame. This pulses, he said. It does not merely block. It scrambles. It prevents the currents from finding a stable path. Saren's breathing had slowed without his noticing. The air in the room felt different now, sharper, cleaner. Aurel stepped toward the doorway and placed the hyssor branch beside it. This is the threshold, he explained. Entry points matter. He carried the cedar to the corner where woven mats lay stacked for sleeping. Where consciousness loosens, he said, setting it down gently, is where interference is strongest. Then he returned to the center of the room and placed the white flame on the central table. The heart of a dwelling must pulse. He turned back to them. You have been told to beg the heavens for protection, Aurel said, and a faint smile touched his lips. But the true source does not respond to begging. He placed his hand over his own chest. It responds to recognition. The room felt warmer now. Or perhaps it was the students themselves. When you speak, he continued, your voice carries more than meaning. It carries pattern. When that pattern aligns with what the source has already woven into the living world, the field locks into place. Malek swallowed. And what do we say? Aurel's eyes softened. You do not ask, he replied. You declare. He stepped to the center, near the white flame. Stand. They obeyed. Place your hand over your chest. 12 hands rose. Feel that warmth, Aurel instructed. That is not imagination. That is origin. He inhaled slowly, and they followed. Now speak with me. His voice was steady, calm, not loud, but resonant. I am of the source. This dwelling is sealed. No current born of distortion may remain here. The words settled into the stone like rain into dry earth. Again, he said, turning slightly toward the doorway where Hisser rested. They repeated the declaration a third time, facing the cedar. When silence returned, something had shifted. It was not dramatic. No thunder cracked. No light burst from the ceiling, but the heaviness that had lingered when they first gathered was gone. The air felt clean. Saren exhaled slowly. For the first time in months, his mind did not race ahead of him. It simply rested. Arel looked around the room, studying their faces. You were not meant to live inside interference, he said quietly. You were meant to remember what you are. Outside, the city noises continued as always. But within those stone walls, an unseen field had settled, steady, coherent, and though none of them yet understood how dangerous such knowledge would be in the years to come, each man felt the same realization forming beneath the surface. This was not a metaphor. It was a method. The following weeks did not unfold in dramatic miracles, they unfolded in subtle clarity. Saren was the first to notice the difference. Before that night in the upper chamber, his thoughts had often felt crowded, as if voices overlapped just beyond the edge of awareness. Doubt would arrive when resolve began to form. Fatigue would press against him when he reached for stillness. He had assumed this was simply the condition of being human. Now, something had thinned. When fear attempted to surface in the early hours before dawn, it felt incomplete, unable to root itself. It rose like mist and dissolved before taking shape. The Hisser at the doorway seemed ordinary to the eye, yet the atmosphere near the threshold felt steady, almost firm, like invisible architecture reinforcing the frame. Malek, who slept closest to the cedar branch, experienced something different. His dreams changed. Where once they had been chaotic fragments, falling cities, blurred faces, unfinished arguments, they became structured, coherent. He woke remembering not only images but understanding. Solutions to problems that had felt tangled the day before now presented themselves with surprising simplicity. One morning, as the sun filtered through the lattice window, Malek turned to Arel. It is as if the fog has lifted, he said. Not only from my sleep, but from my sight. Arel nodded. The cedar does not give you knowledge, he replied gently. It removes distortion. The white flame at the center of the chamber seemed the least remarkable of the three. It did not draw attention. It did not dominate the space. Yet the room itself felt different, less stagnant, less heavy. Conversations flowed without friction. Disagreement softened before hardening into conflict. The students began to understand what Arel had meant when he spoke of currents. These forces, he explained one evening as they sat in a quiet circle, are not monsters hiding in shadows. They are patterns embedded in the flawed architecture of this world. He traced a small circle in the dust on the floor. The true source, the infinite origin, is whole. Silent. Complete. But the visible structure around you was shaped by a lesser architect, one who mistook itself for the highest authority. Saren listened carefully. He had heard whispers of such teachings in scattered communities, but never so plainly. This architect, Arel continued, did not work alone. It generated systems, watchers, regulators of perception, to maintain its version of order. Why? Asked Damon, another student. Because a being who forgets it is not ultimate will defend its illusion of control, Arel said calmly. He looked at each of them in turn. These regulators do not attack with claws. They operate through vibration. They influence the mind before a thought forms. They amplify fear. They cloud clarity. They encourage delay. Saren felt a quiet shiver of recognition. Have you not noticed? Arel went on, that doubt appears most strongly when you are about to change? That exhaustion strikes when you reach for stillness? That confusion blooms when purpose sharpens? The room was silent. That is not coincidence, Arel said. It is interference. Malek frowned slightly. If this is so, he asked, why does the temple not teach this? A faint sadness crossed Arel's face. Because a person who can stabilize their own dwelling, he answered, requires no intermediary. He rose and walked slowly to the doorway, resting his hand near the hisser. Institutions prefer dependence, he said quietly. They can guide rituals of smoke and chant. They can prescribe confession and offering. But they cannot control a field that arises from recognition. He returned to the center, near the white flame. When the Empire unified the faith, he continued, his tone steady, teachings about vibrational alignment were among the first to vanish. Not because they were false. Because they were effective. Saren felt the weight of those words. What happened to those who practiced this? He asked. They scattered, Arel replied. Some hid their knowledge in fragments. Others encoded it in metaphor. A few buried scrolls where only time would guard them. He paused, then added softly, but fragments survive. The student sat quietly, absorbing the implication. This is why placement matters, Arel continued. The currents concentrate at thresholds, doorways, corners, places where awareness shifts. When you align the living world with your own declaration, you create coherence. And coherence disrupts distortion. Damon looked thoughtful. So the plants are tools? Arel smiled gently. They are allies, he said. Encoded by the source long before the flawed architect began its design. Saren glanced around the chamber. The air felt lighter than it had ever felt in his life, not euphoric. Not ecstatic, simply clear. Remember this, Arel said quietly. The moment you strengthen your field, resistance may increase. How? Malek asked. Doubt, Arel answered. Mockery. Sudden rationalizations. Thoughts that whisper, nothing changed. Saren's chest tightened slightly, not with fear, but with recognition of how often such thoughts had visited him. When that voice appears, Arel said calmly, do not argue with it. Notice it. Its urgency is proof of disruption. He stepped back, letting silence settle over them. You are not fragile beings in need of constant rescue, he continued. You are carriers of the original spark. Your sensitivity to distortion is not weakness. It is equipment functioning as designed. The oil lamps flickered gently. Outside, the city murmured as it always had, but inside the chamber, something fundamental had shifted, not only in the space, but in their understanding of themselves, and with that shift came a quiet realization. If such sovereignty spread beyond these walls, the structures built on dependence would tremble. It did not take long for the tremor to begin, not in the streets. Not in the markets. But in subtler ways. Saren felt it first as a wave of doubt that arrived without invitation. 3 nights after the seal had been reinforced, he woke just before dawn with a sudden thought pressing against his mind. This is foolish. Leaves cannot alter reality. You are imagining everything. The thought was sharp. Precise. Almost logical. He lay still on his mat, staring at the ceiling beams. For a moment, the old pattern almost reclaimed him, but then he remembered Arel's warning. Do not argue. Notice, Saren exhaled slowly. He did not wrestle the thought. He did not attempt to silence it. He simply observed it the way one observes a passing cart in the street, present, then gone. Within seconds, the pressure dissolved. In its place, there was quiet, not emptiness. Not numbness, clarity. Later that morning, he shared the experience with the others. Malek nodded immediately. The same visited me, he admitted. A voice insisting that nothing had changed. Arel listened without surprise. When a pattern loses access, he said calmly, it attempts to reassert itself through suggestion. He walked to the center of the chamber where the white flame rested, its pale leaves catching the morning light. The flawed architect's design depends on unconscious participation, he continued. If you no longer unconsciously transmit fear or confusion, the system loses efficiency. Damon leaned forward. So the resistance proves the shift? Arel's eyes softened, yes. He paused, letting the weight of that settle. The final strategy of distortion is delay, he added quietly. Tomorrow. Later. When conditions are better. Saren felt a subtle jolt of recognition. How often had he postponed his own clarity? Arel moved toward the doorway and adjusted the hisser slightly, ensuring it remained near the threshold. You must understand, he said gently, this practice is not about plants alone. The plants anchor frequency. But the seal completes only when recognition meets declaration. He stepped back to the center of the room. Stand. They did. Hand over your chest. They obeyed. Feel the warmth. It was there again, subtle, steady. Speak. Together, they declared, I am of the origin. This dwelling is sealed. No current born of distortion may operate here. The words felt different now, less experimental, more grounded. After the third repetition, silence settled over them with a depth none had experienced before. The air seemed almost luminous. Days passed, the shifts deepened. Saren found that situations which once triggered fear now appeared transparent. When anger rose in conversation, he could see the thread beneath it, the attempt to hook, to escalate, to drain. He no longer reacted automatically. He observed. Malek noticed that creative insight flowed more freely. Ideas connected effortlessly. Decisions felt cleaner. Even the physical atmosphere of the chamber changed. Visitors who entered paused unconsciously at the threshold, as if sensing an invisible boundary. Some relaxed immediately. Others grew restless and left quickly. Arel watched quietly. This is what coherence feels like, he said one evening. Not euphoria. Not spectacle. Alignment. He sat with them in stillness for a long time before speaking again. The Empire will continue to standardize belief, he said evenly. Ritual will replace recognition. Symbol will replace method. He glanced toward the plants. The knowledge may fragment. It may be hidden inside metaphor. It may sleep for generations. Saren's throat tightened slightly. Will it be lost? Arel shook his head. Truth embedded in the living world cannot be erased, he replied softly. It can only be forgotten. He stood and walked slowly around the chamber, his hand brushing lightly along the stone wall. You are not followers of a personality, he continued. You are restorers of memory. The white flame pulsed gently in the faint breeze from the window. The seal you create here, Arel said, is a mirror of the seal within you. When your inner field stabilizes, external interference loses grip. He turned toward them fully. Never confuse dependence with devotion, he added quietly. The source does not demand intermediaries. It responds to alignment. Saren felt something settle into place inside him, not belief, but certainty, not arrogance, but steadiness. That night, as he prepared to sleep, the chamber felt deeply calm. No static. No pressure. Only a clean silence that seemed alive rather than empty. He realized then that sovereignty was not dramatic. It was subtle. It was the absence of noise. It was the ability to recognize a thought as foreign without being consumed by it. And as he drifted toward sleep, he understood something else. The most powerful barrier is not built in stone. It is formed through awareness. the practice of the three living plants is not about superstition, nor about elevating objects into idols. It is about remembering that the natural world carries patterns older than institutions, older than empires, older than distortion itself. When you place intention beside living things and speak from recognition rather than fear, you participate in coherence. You do not beg the infinite origin for protection. You align with it. If this story resonated with something quiet inside you, take a moment to reflect on where interference may be operating in your own space, not as paranoia, but as awareness. Consider how subtle shifts in environment and declaration can restore clarity. If you found value in this exploration, share it with someone who has been seeking steadiness. Leave a comment describing what coherence feels like to you. And if you would like to continue exploring symbolic practices, forgotten cosmologies, and inner sovereignty, subscribe so you do not miss the next conversation. Clarity spreads quietly, and sometimes, remembering is the most radical act of all.